Welcome to this special edition of the New Stack Makers on the Road. We're here at the Open Source Summit in Austin, Texas. Discussions from the show floor with technologists giving you their expertise and insights to help you with your everyday work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Omier with the New Stack, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Austin. And I'm chatting with Amanda Brock of OpenUK. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me along today.
And can you introduce yourself and OpenUK? What do you do?
Sure. We are an industry organization based in the UK, and we're about open technology, not just software. So open source software, open hardware, and open data. I think we're the first organization that shifted to the three, and we branded open technology. And we're probably at heart an advocacy and policy group, but we do community, legal and policy, and learning. And I always like to say that we use the community power, the leadership power it has to influence policy in the UK, and then to build the next generation of influencers through teaching them skills in open technologies. And me, I'm an ex-lawyer. I'm CEO at OpenUK. I've been the CEO for just over 2 years. I spent 25 years being a lawyer before that, which is long enough for anybody, I have to say. 5 of those were at Canonical, and I joined Canonical in early 2008, and the rest is history for me with open source.
So, Amanda, I know you have a lot of thoughts about sustainability of open source projects and funding, the funding aspect of how an open source project is sustainable. What are some of the models for financially supporting an open source project?
Yeah, absolutely, Emily. I've just done a huge amount of research over the last couple of years. Some of the stuff I already knew, and then looking at what everybody else is saying in this space, because I've written a book chapter that we can talk more about later on exactly that topic. And I think the really interesting thing about the models is back in 2008, 451 produced the first report on open source business models, commercial models. And they came up with 8 categories. And I actually think even today, those 8 categories are probably what still apply. And it's the usual suspects. It's the things that we would expect to be there.
Like what?
Okay, so support, subscription, open core. Back in 2008, it wasn't called open core. Having a benefactor of some sort. There's a very limited suite of models there. The collaborative community engagement, that kind of thing. But I think what you really see is that there are 2 or 3 fundamental models that work, and they tend to be what I would call support, subscription, like the Red Hat type model, the Tidelift type model, or open core. And I think that term is one that we should unpack because it probably covers a multitude of sins.
So I was curious about that because I've certainly seen companies that have an open source project and a commercial product, and they don't overlap in functionality.
Yeah.
So they're related.
Yeah.
And the example I was thinking of was a Threat Mapper and Threat Striker.
Yeah.
Threat Mapper identifies vulnerabilities. Threat Striker takes action, basically. If you have Threat Striker, you pay them, you would still need to use the open source project. Where does that fit?
So I would put that in open core because I think that the core of the commercial product is the open source one. And you can't really use the commercial one without adopting that open source one. And the question then becomes, is the open source piece something that's readily usable on its own? Or is it something that you have to buy the extra for? And I think you really get I'm ruthlessly ripping off Adam Jacob here. And I think he's got the best way of explaining this, where he talks about loose and tight open core. And I think that you get 2 different kinds of open core business. One that is driven very much for the needs of the company, and one that's driven for the needs of the open source project and community. And he splits those really nicely with this tight and loose concept.
So which is which?
So I'm going to get this the wrong way around. I'm going to try and remember tight and loose as terms with the right definitions. And I think tight is when you serve the needs of the corporate entity. So you're absolutely driven by revenue generation to promote shareholder value for that corporate, and the open source piece is almost incidental. It might even, and I think this is very bad, become a sort of a marketing tool to drive you towards your commercial product. Whereas when you're looking at the loose version, you're thinking about the community. You're thinking, I've got an open source project here, I've got a product, I want people to adopt this. How can I also generate enough revenue to pay for the excellence of this community and to have a business that we can use to sustain the developers and the maintainers? It's a great way to split it, right?
It absolutely is, because that's the balance that a lot of companies are trying to strike, and figuring out which one feels authentic and, which one feels authentic so they, sleep at night, and then also which one is going to be successful. Financially successful, I suppose I should say.
And I don't think those have to be mutually exclusive. I think the financially successful can be in an organization and in a project and product that is focused on a community. And when you're sort of looking at them from a distance, it's the organizations, the companies that have a proper community that are the ones that really are open source to me. And that's that. I think Adam would use loose for that. I hope I haven't got this the wrong way around. But, the definition is something we both understand. And that's where you've got a proper project with a real community. The community is not entirely based up of your employees. Often you'll see that the single product vendors are the problem, and they're the ones that are most likely to move from being open source to proprietary. They tend not to have a community that's authentic, to use your word. They tend to have in-house communities, and those are the ones that build those models that are really about revenue generation and nothing else.
Yeah, it definitely seems like, I think of HashiCorp when thinking about like a loose,
Yeah,
if we were
I love
using it
HashiCorp.
correctly, and also commercially successful.
Exactly.
Well, we've talked a lot about sort of commercial models.
Yeah.
Are there any non-commercial ways that you can financially sustain an open source project?
There's the sort of benefactor coming along. I think you can do it on the back of a community, but it depends on what your end goals are, right? There have been lots of projects that haven't been about revenue, that have gone down the routes of having a foundation. And that foundational model is obviously really important. And it's something that we see more and more of as we see more businesses and sectors coming into open source, trying to work out how they collaborate, taking the benefit of an existing foundation and either setting up a sub-foundation or just learning from that to set up something for themselves. I think back in 2012, when I was at Canonical, I worked on the setup of OpenStack, and that was really interesting, seeing how companies who competed came together. But even then, it was mainly tech companies. I think now we're seeing verticals and sectors, things like retail, starting to work out how do we build a base platform for our sector, and they know that open source is the way to do it. So I think there's those other models too.
Yeah, I think you brought up something really important about non-tech companies starting to have meaningful support for open source. It also makes me think of the role of an OSPO at, a retailer or a Toyota or something like that, in creating a community that could be, or creating an open source project that's maybe a bunch of competitors.
Yeah, one of the things we've just been doing in the UK at OpenUK is we've been looking at the journey that we see organizations go through from sort of consumption to contribution to distribution of products and services that include open source. And the way we structured our survey this year, we can differentiate between the stage they're at and how long they've been doing each of those. And what you really start to see is a maturity model. And as you go along that journey, you start to deal with things like security. You're not going to distribute open source, I would hope, without understanding what security is about, without understanding SBOMs. But then if you look at a consumer, they don't have the need for that sophistication. And I think we're seeing sectors take something like 3 to 5 years to shift from that initial usage to being a sophisticated user.
So I had actually a sort of unrelated question I've been wanting to ask, which is, you sort of specialize in open source in the UK. Is it different? Is there anything like meaningfully different about the UK?
So I'm going to say, well, there's a lot meaningfully different about the UK. So I would say that we really came to the fore after Brexit. And what we were seeing in Europe was that there was a huge amount of focus within the Commission across the European institutions on open source. And the UK had been ahead. Back in 2012, we started an open source first policy in government. It was one of the first in the world. And changes in administration changed the focus. And it felt like we were getting behind. So a bunch of us have got together and we've realized that there's just a massive amount of leadership, particularly around Kubernetes, cloud native and cloud generally in the UK. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of developers. And we started to look at the global data, and we saw that the UK is number 1 in Europe, probably number 5 globally in terms of contribution. So we really wanted to push this forward for the private and public sector and to get more engagement. So our purpose is actually UK leadership and international collaboration. And we're very, very much about working with the rest of the world, which is why we're here. We want to see everyone.
Even like tying that back in actually to the funding question, do you think it matters where you are in the world for your funding, for how you're going to financially support this?
So we have some really amazing startups that are scaling. Weaveworks is one of the obvious ones that we could talk about. We could talk about some of the ones that haven't scaled. So we have an entrepreneur in residence at OpenUK, Matt Barker at JetStack. Matt grew his company and sold it. He was one of the first Kubernetes. We see Weaveworks scaling. We see someone like David Mitten, who is part of the Founders Forum that we run with the Entrepreneur in Residence. He built the agent that Datadog is based on. He scaled his company, took it to New York, sold it, and now Datadog has made a lot of money on that. He's really lovely about it. He's got the right attitude for open source, but he's like, that's open source. I created it, they used it. But when we look at these companies in the UK, I'm talking about people who've left. I'm talking about people who've stayed. Not many have stayed. And they leave for 3 reasons. They leave for investment, they leave because there's a big market here, and they leave because we don't have the skill sets. And we're really working hard to identify what's needed and how we fix that. We have great engineers. If you're anywhere in the world, you're going to come to the UK looking for your engineers as your second or third port of call. But you won't necessarily come to us for those general, revenue generation, compliance, governance, marketing skills. And it's hard to employ people when you're based in the UK from the US. The time zones make it hard. So we see now companies like Weaveworks starting to scale, Snyx in the UK as well, massively successful. And we want to make sure there's more of those. So we're trying to develop and evolve those skills and build training around it.
Yeah, this is actually a theme I've heard from a lot of European founders.
Yeah.
I know lots of them, and many of them have ended up coming to the US.
Yeah, and we'd really like to have more of a homegrown market. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but at least we've tried. We've tried to make a difference to that.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you, everyone who joined us. I am Emily Omier with The New Stack.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.